Okay, the subcommittee will come to order. Members will present will be permitted to submit written statements to be included in the official hearing record. Without objection, the hearing record will remain open for 5 calendar days to allow statements, questions, and extraneous material for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. We will be joined by members of the full committee who are not members of the subcommittee, and without objection they will be allowed to ask questions at the end of the first round of questions. The first opening statement will be delivered by our ranking member, Ted Yoho.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for calling this hearing. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss the fiscal year 2020 State Department and U.S. Agency for International Development budget request for the South Asia region. I'd also like to thank our distinguished witnesses for being here today. The relationship between the United States and countries in South Asia concerning democracy promotion and economic growth is ripe for cooperation. However, the region also faces significant challenges, particularly involving China's increased influence in the region. We've also seen the continued proliferation of human rights abuses and acts of radical terrorism. I would like to focus this hearing on how U.S. expenditures support the health of U.S. Asia's democratic institutions, increase economic development, and address security concerns, while best serving U.S. interests. In recent years, we've seen an increased focus on South Asia. In 2017, the Trump administration announced their Freedom and Open Indo-Pacific strategy, which restructured the typical Asia-Pacific approach and emphasized the importance of this region to the U.S. and our national security. This area is vital for national security, the development and the growth. As we've heard over and over again, there's going to be more people living in the Asia-Pacific theater by 2050 in the world than outside of that. This strategy is marked by respect for sovereignty, freedom of navigation, open markets, and transparent investment in the Indo-Pacific, and is carried out by agencies like the Department of State and USAID, whom we have here today with us, and we're so excited. A June 2019 Pentagon report called the Indo-Pacific the single most consequential region for America's future. For this reason, we must continue to address the region's shifting geopolitical landscape, increasing complex security outlook, lingering human rights issues, not lingering human rights issues, but more egregious human rights issues that we haven't seen since probably World War II, and enduring development challenges. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the Department of State and USAID intend to address these concerns and how Congress can best support them in these endeavors. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Yoho. Today's hearing examines the administration's budget request for South Asia and our interests in the region. We look forward to hearing from Ambassadors Wells, Ms. Steele, and Ms. Friedman. I'll introduce them at the end of my opening remarks. In the 4 years from 2014 to 2017, our annual aid to South Asia averaged $2.2 billion. This included $1 billion for Afghanistan and nearly $800 million for Pakistan. But our 2018 budget for South Asia has dropped almost in half, and the FY 2020 budget is proposed at $1 billion, including $500 million or a bit more than that for Afghanistan and $70 million for Pakistan. This is a dramatic reduction in our efforts. Will be interesting to hear from our witnesses whether South Asia is dramatically less important to us than it was a few years ago. As to India, we have a strategic partnership in the Indo-Pacific. I'm working to strengthen that relationship as co-chair of the India Caucus. Our partnership is built around common democratic values, our economic relations, and our strategic interests. And of course, there have been several steps forward in the area of joint naval exercises, whether it be U.S.-India or U.S.-Japan-India. We do have a $24 billion trade deficit with India. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses how we're going to open India's markets and how India is going to open its markets so that American exports will increase. As to Pakistan, USAID projects have covered energy, agriculture, education, and the health sectors. There's a small but growing middle-class civil society, independent judiciary, and we've had 2 elected changes in government, at least in the, what should I say, official government, as opposed to whatever role in government the military plays beyond what's set forth in the Constitution. That being said, our aid to Pakistan less than a decade ago was $2 billion a year. We now have cut it to $70 million. If I did the math quickly, I'd just say that's under 5. That's a 95% reduction, roughly. Pakistan, I think, is very important to the security of the United States. There are those that argue that Pakistan is important because it's close to Afghanistan, and I think it's just the reverse. It's true that looking at history, looking at 2001, Afghanistan suddenly became critical to our national security, and the fact that al-Qaeda was able to operate there had devastating effects on our country. But looking forward, it's clear that Pakistan will have a much bigger impact on the United States, and of course is a nuclear country with a nuclear weapons state with a growing nuclear arsenal. I will want to hear about what we're doing with regard to forced conversions, particularly in southern Pakistan, where young girls are in effect kidnapped, forced to convert, and then forced to Islam, and then forced to marry. And I'll want to focus on human rights in Pakistan as a whole, and particularly in Sindh province, and of course Pakistan giving safe haven to terrorists that attack Afghanistan and India. Now, given the importance of Pakistan, I don't think there's anything more important than our public broadcasting to the people of Pakistan. We broadcast, however, only in one Pakistani language, Pashto, which is both a Pakistani and an Afghan language, leaving out the many tens of millions of Pakistanis that speak Sindhi. I've offered an amendment which is pending on the floor, and my staff may have pulled me out of this room, and if so, it's for a good reason, one that I'm sure all of our witnesses will agree with, and that is to increase the budget of Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty so that they can begin a Sindhi language service. Whether we'll be able to get them the full $1.5 million that they've said they wanted for a 24-hour service, or whether it will be less, will depend upon the legislative process. And whether we get anything will depend upon the legislative process. But given Pakistan is, for example, the only state with nuclear weapons that has experienced a military coup. And I'll turn to the historians on our panel to tell me just how many military coups Pakistan has had. But that's 100% of all the military coups in all nuclear states. So we do need to reach out to the people of Pakistan, and I'm by no means sure that the $70 million we're spending is sufficient. Further, I'll point out that the big thing we're doing for Pakistan is the IMF loan. While our aid is $70 million, the IMF loan is $6 billion. And of course, I don't think that could have happened without the United States. And I hope that I'll be told by our witnesses that when Treasury's over there at the IMF, they aren't just checking the boxes for fiscal purposes, but are in fact taking policy direction from the State Department. In Afghanistan, we've given $130 billion in security and development assistance since 2001. The conflict continues. The Taliban finds safe havens in Pakistan. One of the reasons for this is because Pakistan fears a united Afghanistan that might make claims on its territory, particularly at a time when Pakistan might be preoccupied with India. The way to make Pakistan calmer and more solidly in favor of a peaceful, strong, and prosperous Afghanistan is to gain international recognition from the Durand Line. I'll discuss with our witnesses what we can do at the United Nations to get the entire world to recognize the Durand Line and to make it plain to Afghanistan and Pakistan that their border is that line and that they can live in peace without either side, particularly without Afghanistan looking for an opportunity to expand its territory. As for Sri Lanka, we all express our deepest condolences to those affected by the tragic Easter Sunday terrorist attacks. These attacks took place 10 years after Sri Lanka ended its civil war, and I hope that these attacks will not impede the reconciliation efforts between the Ceylonese and Tamil communities. As to democracy, development, and burden sharing, our foreign aid has supported development in the Maldives, which might be the first nation submerged if we don't do something about global warming and global climate change, Nepal and Bangladesh. And I want to commend Bangladesh for hosting hundreds of thousands of Rohingya from neighboring Myanmar. As I've said in this room before, if Myanmar or Burma is unwilling and or unable to be a good government for the Rohingya people that live in North Rakhine State, then we should transfer, and the United States should support the transfer of that portion of that state to Bangladesh, which is willing to accommodate the people. The Rohingya people of North Rakhine State deserve a government that tries to protect them, not destroy them. Overall, our aid can consolidate democracy and advance development across South Asia. Freedom House scores the region at 3.7 on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 is the highest. This is better than the 4.8 score of Southeast Asia, but the per capita income from South Asia is only $6,700, measured in purchasing power, which is 40% less than Southeast Asia. So there is much development work to be done in South Asia. In recent years, Australia and Canada have annually given $200 million. Japan gave nearly $600 million. In European countries have dispersed apparently $3 billion to South Asia. I encourage our allies to continue that element of burden sharing as we, of course, carry the lion's share of the load when it comes to defense expenditures. With that, I'll see whether there are other members of the subcommittee wishing to make an opening statement. Mr. Perry? Mr. Lee? Well, with that, we'll start with our witnesses. We'll start with Ambassador Alice Wells, former U.S. Ambassador to Jordan, who has headed the South Asia Bureau at the State Department for 2 years as acting Assistant Secretary. Of course, our committee has been urging for the last over 2 years the administration to actually have permanent people in the positions. And I know that the party line of the administration is you don't need permanent people, but I think we do. I'm not saying that our Ambassador Wells wouldn't be the perfect permanent Assistant Secretary, but the idea that you can operate the executive branch without appointing people, getting them confirmed, and filling the positions is absurd. That being said, we also will hear from Ms. Gloria Steele, who is acting Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Asia at the U.S. Agency for International Development, USAID. And then finally, we'll hear from Ms. Karen Freeman, who is Assistant to the Administrator for the Office of Afghanistan and Pakistan Affairs, again at USAID. Ambassador Wells.
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yoho, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting me to testify on the Department's fiscal year 2020 budget request for Afghanistan, Pakistan, and South Asia. And before we begin, I want to recognize the servicemen and women, the diplomats, the development specialists who risk their lives in service to our country, particularly one Department of Commerce employee, Chelsea De Kamanada, for her ultimate sacrifice during the Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka. Her commitment to public service is a model for all of us, and she served her country with distinction. I'll first talk about our work in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and then continue by describing the progress we've made on our Indo-Pacific strategy in India and South Asia. Our goal in Afghanistan is a sustainable political settlement to end the war. Our conditions-based approach is working, and the Taliban have come to the table. As Secretary Pompeo has testified, the President wants to reduce the risks and costs to Americans in a manner that protects our counterterrorism interests. President Ghani shares this vision. I traveled to Kabul last month, where the Afghan government agreed to focus assistance on our highest priorities: peace, self-reliance, and stability. We've been working with other donors to develop a post-settlement economic plan while not losing focus on the need to strengthen democratic institutions, include women, and see credible presidential elections in September. This request supports those objectives. We recognize that durable peace in Afghanistan requires consultation with Pakistan, and Pakistan is encouraging the Taliban to negotiate. But our relationship with Pakistan is broader than just Afghanistan. We are asking Islamabad to take sustained and irreversible actions against terrorists who threaten stability in the subcontinent. One such organization, Jaish-e-Mohammed, precipitated the India-Pakistan crisis in February, and we've made clear that there's no legitimate role for these non-state actors. On May 1, we succeeded in listing Masood Azhar, the leader of that organization, at the United Nations 1267 Sanctions Committee, an achievement that was 10 years in the making. Our tailored assistance request for Pakistan reflects a relationship that is moving from aid to a more mature, trade-based partnership. From Afghanistan and Pakistan, we turn to South Asia, where we support India's rise as the fulcrum of the administration's Indo-Pacific strategy. Prime Minister Modi is committed to strengthening ties between our two countries, and we congratulate him on his decisive election victory. India's election was free and fair and the largest exercise of democracy in human history. As the Secretary said at yesterday's India Ideas Forum, it's only natural that the world's most populous democracy should partner with the world's oldest democracy to maintain our shared vision for the Indo-Pacific. With India at its center, we've made good incremental progress on our Indo-Pacific vision since I last testified to the subcommittee. In July, the Secretary announced $114 million in economic assistance at the Indo-Pacific Business Forum, and in August, he announced $300 million in security assistance at the ASEAN Regional Forum. In November, the Vice President announced the Indo-Pacific Transparency Initiative in conjunction with over $400 million in democracy, rights, and governance assistance, and we thank Congress for supporting and approving these announcements. The Indo-Pacific strategy is beginning to register successes. In September, the Maldives voted out the preceding corrupt regime that was implicated in secretive, unsustainable procurements of debt-financed infrastructure. Maldives instead elected a new president who is strengthening his country's outreach to both India and the United States. Maldives is a concrete example of how our Indo-Pacific vision can inspire engaged voters and civil society to push back against corruption through the ballot box. We're happy to see that Congress supports this vision, and we thank you for passing the Asia Reassurance Initiative Act with broad bipartisan support. The President was happy to sign. To conclude, this has been a year of success in our region, and our budget request reflects that. While Afghanistan transitions to a more sustainable post-settlement mission, the administration is refocusing its assistance request on the Indo-Pacific. I welcome today's discussion and hope we can agree to support America's diplomacy in this indispensable region. Thank you.
Ms. Freeman.
Good morning, Chairman Deutsch and Sherman, ranking members, Wilson and Yoho, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for having me here today to discuss the administration's fiscal year 2020 budget request for the U.S. Agency for International Development's assistance priorities for Afghanistan and Pakistan. As a career Foreign Service officer, it's been my honor to serve my country and a privilege to testify before you today alongside my esteemed colleagues, Ambassador Alice Wells and Assistant Administrator Gloria Steele. Like those before me, I would like to thank our colleagues, the women and the men in our military who have served in Afghanistan, who in some cases have given their lives. And I would also like to express my appreciation to their families. Our gratitude also goes to the brave American civilians who have served in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, USAID's Foreign Service officers, development professionals, and Foreign Service nationals, diplomats of the United States Department of State, and the men and women working shoulder to shoulder with us, implementing U.S. programs in the region and around the world. I've been proud to have served with these people over the past 30 years, and they have my deepest respect. Under USAID Administrator Mark Green's leadership, our agency's mission is to support our partners to become self-reliant and capable of leading their own development journeys. A key stepping stone on this path to self-reliance is ensuring governments are responsive and accountable to their citizens and to the international community. We make progress toward this by increasing private sector economic growth, strengthening democratic governance, and enhancing health and education outcomes. But we must also reduce the reach of conflict and counteract the drivers of violence and instability. Specifically, USAID has 3 strategic development objectives in each country. In Afghanistan, accelerating private sector-driven export-led economic growth, including the growth of high-value agriculture, sustaining and advancing social gains in health, education, and women's opportunities, and increasing the Afghan government's accountability to its citizens, including anti-corruption and government and elections. In Pakistan, our objectives are helping to consolidate Pakistan's civilian government control on the border with Afghanistan, particularly in the newly merged districts of Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, supporting civil society's efforts to build a more tolerant Pakistan, and promoting private sector-led economic growth, including creating opportunities for U.S. businesses. The President's FY 2020 budget request for assistance to Afghanistan and Pakistan reflects our nation's efforts to advance our national security interests and increase regional stability. The fiscal year 2020 request for USAID in Pakistan includes $48 million in economic support funds. It is anticipated that our request for $400 million for Afghanistan will be adjusted downward as a result of recent program reviews. As Ambassador Wells has outlined, this has been a year of reflection on the appropriate balance of resources, both human and financial, in Afghanistan and Pakistan. Both missions are undergoing intense scrutiny and consultation with our partners, the interagency, and yourselves here on Capitol Hill. The lower request continues a downward trend as our assistance portfolios mature, adjust towards a more sustainable level. Although the 2020 request is reduced in comparison to fiscal year 2019, both missions will continue to implement a significant suite of assistance programs which are strategic and long-term and incorporate our partners, other donors, and the private sector. And of course, the countries themselves as we engage in dialogue on encompassing their aspirations and our comparative advantages. Experience shows that women's participation in development is a key driver for sustainable outcomes, including enhanced economic growth, improved health, education, and community cohesion, and the reduction of conflict. Support for Afghan and Pakistani women is and will remain an important focus for USAID. Afghan women in particular have achieved much with the continuing support from the American people, and furthering these gains is a cornerstone of USAID's efforts. Again, thank you for inviting me here today to discuss USAID's programs in Afghanistan and Pakistan. I look forward to answering your questions.
Ms. Steele?
Chairman Sherman, Ranking Member Yoho, distinguished subcommittee members, thank you for inviting me to testify on USAID's role in advancing U.S. policy priorities in South Asia, including the President's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific, the South Asia Strategy, and USAID's journey to self-reliance. First, I'll speak to the President's vision for a free and open Indo-Pacific region. The fiscal year 2020 budget request for USAID's development assistance in South Asia is $332 million. This request includes support for USAID's continued leading role in advancing the Indo-Pacific strategy in three primary areas. First is strengthening democratic systems, which are critical for fostering good governance and transparency. Second is leveling the playing field for the participation of legitimate private enterprises, especially in the areas of infrastructure and digital economy. And the third is improving the management of natural resources, particularly in energy, which are important for sustained long-term growth. Second, the South Asia Strategy. The South Asia Strategy recognizes the strategic importance of the region for stability in Afghanistan. The request supports continued USAID engagement important to this objective, for example, deepening our strategic partnership with India, which shares economic and humanitarian interests in Afghanistan. And third, the journey to self-reliance. In the words of USAID Administrator Mark Green, the ultimate goal of development assistance must be to work toward the day when it is no longer necessary. He has said, and I quote, "At the heart of our work is the core belief that each country must lead its own development journey." We call the path to get there the journey to self-reliance. In support of this, we focus on building capacity and commitment of countries to drive their own development. This includes commitments to open and accountable governance and inclusive growth, and it includes the capacity to mobilize funds domestically for their development. With fiscal year 2020 resources, we will continue to strategically focus our efforts toward achievement of this goal. I will next provide brief country highlights. For Bangladesh, our request includes resources for life-saving assistance to Rohingya refugees and for ramping up our support to impacted host communities. In addition, our request supports programs aimed at restoring democratic processes, political pluralism, and good governance, improving the business enabling environment and agricultural economy, strengthening the conservation of targeted ecosystems in order to mitigate the impact of natural disasters, and attracting renewable energy investments. Our programs support Bangladesh in its goal of achieving middle-income status by 2024. For India, our budget request supports India's integral role to advancing both a free and open Indo-Pacific region and a stable South Asia. For example, India is central in our efforts to facilitate infrastructure and energy investment and connectivity across South Asia. The request includes new funds for regional energy activities that contribute to advancing the President's vision of a free and open Indo-Pacific. It also supports Asia Edge, a U.S. government initiative to promote energy security and expand energy access across the Indo-Pacific region. The request will also enable USAID to leverage domestic resources, including from India's robust private sector that is legally mandated to contribute to social causes, in ways that help India better respond to its lingering development challenges, including poor health conditions, inadequate resources related to water and sanitation, and air pollution. For Nepal, despite steadfast progress, the country remains vulnerable to unsustainable debt, weak institutional capacity, and future disasters. Following on USAID's support for the historic 2017 elections, the request will allow USAID to address emerging challenges to Nepal's transition to federalism. Our request also supports efforts to improve the country's weak business regulatory environment, advance a competitive market economy, and address health, food security, and education challenges. For Sri Lanka, recent political turmoil compounded by the April terrorist attacks, growing ethnic religious nationalism, and slow progress and commitment to transitional justice and ethnic reconciliation exacerbate the country's development challenges. With elections on the horizon for late 2019 and early 2020, USAID will use fiscal year 2020 resources to bolster democratic governance, foster ethnic reconciliation, and enhance fair opportunities for trade and competitiveness. Assistance will also provide the government of Sri Lanka with technical support for infrastructural development and for fostering the rule of law. And finally, for the Maldives, fiscal year 2020 resources will enable USAID to advance US interests and seize burgeoning opportunities presented by the country's democratic opening. We will also use fiscal year 2020 resources to support the government's request for assistance in public financial management, in countering terrorism, and in managing its natural resources. In closing, South Asia is a strategically important region for the United States. With this request, USAID will continue efforts vital to increasing partner countries' self-reliance and advancing a free and open Indo-Pacific region. Thank you.
I want to thank all of our witnesses. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. Ambassador Wells, how important is it for us to reach out to the people of Pakistan in the languages they actually speak in their home, particularly in the language of Sindh?
Very important, sir, and we do, through our Karachi consulate, have programming in Sindhi language to the 50 million person audience in that region. We also have local staff, whether it's in Karachi or elsewhere in the country, that are engaged in Sindhi language outreach.
So you're able to reach people by sending speakers out, by convening meetings, but if we did broadcasting in Sindhi, we'd be able to reach all 50 million people. I hope you support that effort. For the record? Yeah.
We appreciate additional efforts of outreach in Pakistan.
Now, the big aid, and we're here talking about 70 million for Pakistan. The big issue is the IMF loan. It looks like that is going through. Ambassador Wells, does Treasury just do what they want for checking off some economic boxes, or since this is the single most important thing we do with regard to Pakistan, do they listen to you?
Yes, there's a discussion about the conditionality that we think would be appropriate for an IMF package to Pakistan. We've not seen the IMF package yet. We understand that there's been an agreement reached between the IMF and government of Pakistan. But certainly we have communicated our strong views, and Secretary Pompeo has also done so publicly, on the need for any package to include a real structural reform to reinforce.
If I can interrupt, what about Dr. Afridi? Should we block this IMF loan until Dr. Afridi and his family are free here in the United States?
We believe Dr. Afridi is being held wrongly, inappropriately. With Congress's help, we have withheld $130 million in assistance to Pakistan already as a result of his incarceration, and we continue to raise Dr. Afridi's case.
But we're letting them get what they really want, which is the $6 billion from the IMF, and if they default on that, the American taxpayers lose well over $1 billion. Have we offered any prisoner exchange? For example, Dr. Siddiqui, who I know is cooperated in terrorism, but is still, given Dr. Afridi's critical role, are we negotiating, are we seeking to negotiate with Pakistan some sort of prisoner release?
We have not offered a prisoner exchange for Dr. Afridi. Dr. Afridi is being held wrongly. He's not guilty of any terrorism charges.
Almost every prisoner exchange, when we exchanged spies with the Soviets, the spies that we gave up were people working for communism, and the people we got back were people working for freedom. By all rights, they should have been freed anyway. I would hope that as another committee looks at those who are the first responders at 9/11, that you would do more to get Dr. Afridi released and offer more on the plus side, even if it's unjust, and withhold on the other side, because who's going to ever help America stop terrorism as long as Dr. Afridi's in jail? I've talked before about the missing persons and forced disappearances, particularly of religious minorities in the Sindh province of Pakistan. I'll ask I'll ask all of our witnesses, to what extent do we bring up these human rights issues in our interactions with Pakistani officials? Ms. Steele? And if it's Ms. Friedman who pretty much deals with the back, then I'll just, Ms. Friedman.
It is Ms. Friedman.
USAID remains concerned about all of the reports on human rights violations, and not only do we raise that with the government officials, but we also try to encourage the new initiatives with the government of Pakistan and strengthen civil society to that end. Thank you.
My time has expired. My list of questions has not. We'll call on other members, and we'll do a second round for those who are still here. We'll hear from our ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your testimony. Ambassador Wells, it was music to my ears to hear you say moving countries from aid to trade as soon as possible. From a hearing like this, it's amazing when I look back. It led to the inspiration for the BUILD Act, and that's how that happened. That led to the bipartisan support to create the new IDFC, the International Development Finance Corporation, modernizing and OPEC and strengthening our foreign development arm, moving, again, countries from aid to trade. So out of this meeting, we hope to move beyond that. It's such a large region, from Afghanistan over to the east, encompassing all the countries in between. I think it's about 1.8 billion people just in that region. And what I hear again when we talk about development, I hear over and over again we need to build democracies. And I've been a proponent of, I don't think that's the right way to go. You guys have got collectively a tremendous amount of experience. I think more importantly, we should develop stable governments. If I look at the history that's been learned, or the lessons that's been learned from Afghanistan, we moved into a country that we did not understand. We didn't understand the tribal nature of a country, and we tried to instill a democracy. And as we know, democracies are very messy, as we've learned over 240 plus years. I think we should adapt our strategy and policies to fulfill the needs of a country and develop a stable government. Because I see right now we're negotiating with the Taliban, but somebody correct me if I'm wrong, they were a terrorist organization, and we had a policy we don't negotiate with terrorists. Yet they control more land in Afghanistan today than they did before we went into Afghanistan. My question to you is, the Taliban will not negotiate with the current democratically elected Afghan government. Isn't that a major problem? And should the Afghan government be brought into the negotiations?
Absolutely, and Ambassador Khalilzad's mission, or his mandate, is first to ensure that we are not threatened by terrorist groups operating inside of Afghanistan. Two, to protect the investments we've made over the last 18 years in Afghanistan, and then three, to end the war and reduce the burden on the United States. And the way he's approached the negotiations is through four interrelated elements. The first element is to have guarantees and an enforcement mechanism that the Taliban will break all ties with international terrorists, with any terrorist group on Afghan soil. Second, to arrive at guarantees and an enforcement mechanism for the withdrawal of foreign troops. But three is to ensure Taliban participation in intra-Afghan negotiations and dialogue. And that would include the Afghan government, it would include the political opposition, civil society, and women. And then the fourth element is a complete and comprehensive ceasefire. And you can't have one without the other. All four are interrelated. And for example, how would we trust the counterterrorism guarantees if we don't understand the government that emerges from an intra-Afghan negotiation? And so this this process is underway. Ambassador Khalilzad is in Afghanistan right now, working with our partner, President Ghani, and also bringing in the region through his consultations with Russia, China, the Europeans, and Pakistan, of course.
You know, I hear you on the development and the things that we want. We want to, you know, empower people, women, and everybody in society. But again, when you go to a country that's for thousands of years has never had that, and we're kind of forcing this on them, I think if we know that people, when they become more successful economically, when we go in and do major infrastructure development, and that was the impetus behind the BUILD Act, so that we could develop infrastructures that would lead to the development of economies that create the jobs, that bring a better outcome. Generally, I would think you get more stability. I mean, we've been in Nicaragua. We had a hearing on that yesterday with Daniel Ortega, and basically we're still trading with this guy, and he's a communist dictator by all practical means, but yet we pretend it's a democracy, and it's anything but. And so if people don't understand a democracy, I think they would understand a stable government. And again, it pains me that we're negotiating with the Taliban after, what, 18 years and billions or trillions of dollars. I just depend on you with your collective experience to feel bold enough to say, I think we should change the strategy, and if you can't do it in the State Department, slip a note under my office door anonymously, and I'll be happy to follow through with this committee. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
We have many methods of communication with all of you who work hard in our foreign policy agencies. With that, I recognize the gentlelady from Pennsylvania.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you very much for your testimony today. It's nice to see some of you again and some of you for the first time. My question is for Ambassador Wells and Ms. Steele, most likely, but I would welcome anybody to answer it. Yesterday, or probably this morning, because we just got out of the HASC all-day, 24-hour marathon markup, I was able to successfully include an amendment in the NDAA that directs the DoD to conduct research on the role of women in countering violent extremism. Given the horrific Easter Sunday attacks in Sri Lanka, can you talk about the ways that state and USAID are perhaps working with or using women to help prevent the rise of extremism in South Asia?
This is a very strong component, obviously, of the peace process in Afghanistan and ensuring that women's voices and views are incorporated. And so you see that Ambassador Khalilzad actively soliciting the views of women, working with women's organizations in Afghanistan, working with stakeholders to ensure that women are included as representatives in any dialogue or negotiating structure. This is reinforced by the White House's own initiative to emphasize women in peacemaking. And so there will not be peace in Afghanistan if half the population is not understood and accommodated. And I would just add that as we come closer to peace negotiations, the demand for upholding women's education and women's rights has been so strong, and not just from women living in cities, but reports of women under Taliban control. What they want is education and an opportunity to work, and so getting their voices heard is critical. In Sri Lanka, the multi-confessional, multi-ethnic nature of that society, you have to have women also reaching across those boundaries. And so I'll let Gloria discuss the range of programs that we have to do so. Thank you.
You are absolutely right, and a major component of our programs, not just in Sri Lanka, but also in the Maldives, is mobilizing women, the civil society, particularly involving women, and in order to help us address the root causes of violent extremism in both countries. One of the first things that we did when we provided assistance in the Maldives, for instance, was to get civil society together, focusing especially on women and the youth in order to help us try to address violent extremism. This is a major component of our programs.
Thank you, and I certainly look forward to the opportunity to have the DoD do a little bit of research on all of our behalves on this issue. And kind of transitioning into that, on Tuesday, the administration finally released its Women, Peace, and Security Strategy. I think it was about 8 or 9 months late. And last month, I joined many of my colleagues on this committee in sending a bipartisan letter to Secretary Pompeo urging him to ensure the representation of Afghan women in peace negotiations with the Taliban. So I'd like, if it's okay, Mr. Chairman, to enter that, ask for unanimous consent to enter that letter into the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And for the ambassador, I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about the status of those negotiations.
Ambassador Khalilzad has made significant progress in getting the Taliban to the negotiating table, and not just any Taliban, but an empowered negotiating team that represents various constituencies of the Taliban and leadership figures. And in these discussions that have taken place in Doha, and in the discussions that are taking place in Kabul with the government of Afghanistan, hammering out those 4 elements of what are going to constitute, a sustainable peace settlement. And so, the progress is ongoing. The next step, major step that needs to be taken, is to achieve an intra-Afghan dialogue and negotiation. There are certain things that can be discussed between the United States and the Taliban that are appropriate, but certainly nothing can be negotiated over the heads of the Afghan people.
And you feel as though women are being included in those early conversations?
They are, and both in Ambassador Khalilzad's extensive outreach, but also in President Ghani's own solicitation of the views of Afghan women, the role of Afghan women in the Peace Council. I would note that about 1/3 of all voters in the parliamentary elections in Afghanistan were women. We have 69 women members of parliament. Women are part and parcel of not just government, but all aspects of society now in Afghanistan, and it's one of the foremost achievements of the last 18 years.
Thank you, and my time has expired, and I yield back.
We move from the gentlelady from Pennsylvania to the gentleman from Pennsylvania.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, and to thank our panelists for their attendance today. Ambassador Wells, I want to turn to India a little bit and have a discussion regarding our ties, India's ties with Russia, especially on the military side, and in particular the purchase or acquisition of S-400 surface-to-air missiles, and if that will result in, or in your view, if it will invoke CAATSA sanctions, and what's India's calculation in receiving that weaponry from Russia, and is there any indication that they did so because they couldn't get some like kind of capability from the United States?
Thank you. I think we've seen India over the years, in particular over the last 10 years, start to diversify its weapons sources. And so our trade relationship in defense sector went from 0 to 18 billion over the last 18 years, and we expect continued progress in expanding that defense relationship. But it's still the case that about 65 or 70% of India's military hardware is Russian origin. And when President Putin visited in October of last year, there were additional announcements of big-ticket military items that were potentially under consideration. What causes concern with the S-400 is that it effectively could limit India's ability to increase our own interoperability, that at a certain point a strategic choice has to be made about partnerships and a strategic choice about what weapon systems and platforms a country is going to adopt. It is the case that 10 years ago we did not offer the range of military equipment to India that we're prepared to offer today. And so we're very much engaged in a conversation with India over how we can broaden our defense relationship. And you saw a key step forward last year when the ministers of state and defense met each other, when we negotiated and signed the CAATSA agreement, which allows for the classified sharing of information, the sharing of classified information, one of these basic foundational agreements that foster military interoperability. So we're making, I think, significant strides forward forward in our military relationship. There is no blanket waiver or country waiver when it comes to an S-400. We have serious concerns about a possible S-400 purchase, and we're continuing our conversations on what the United States or other defense providers, how they could assist India.
Sorry about that. Were we aware that they were in negotiation for the S-400 prior to its acquisition? I mean, did we know they were engaging in that with Russia in advance of the acquisition and the delivery? I mean, were we in the conversation?
We were aware of India and Russia's negotiations. These have been long running.
I'm sure.
Many, many years in the making. And so
what did we do to try and dissuade dissuade India and encourage them to take a different path, particularly with the S-400? And did we do anything to offer any alternatives, or was it and is it inappropriate to do that at this time?
Well, I think under the Trump administration, we've been very clear that, that we're ready to help meet India's defense needs, and we are seeking a very different kind of defense partnership, building on the major defense partner designation that India has received from Congress. And so how to make that as robust and as meaningful a relationship as possible. You know, we now do more military exercises with India than with any other country. Just a few weeks ago, India, the United States, Philippines, and Japan did a sail-by in the South China Sea. In both our bilateral, trilateral, quadrilateral formats, we're working together in ways that we didn't even conceive of 10 years ago. And so we'd like all aspects of our military relationship to catch up to this new partnership.
What do you envision the relationship with the U.S. and India vis-a-vis China strategically? I mean, can you give us like a 1, 2, 3 overview of what the State Department envisions for that relationship or of that relationship vis-a-vis China?
Both the United States and India believe in a free and open Indo-Pacific region. We believe, so first, you know, we are worried about China's ambitions and aggressions as they're manifesting themselves in the Indo-Pacific. I think second, we are concerned by a policy of predatory lending, unsustainable loans, loans that don't adhere to labor environmental standards, and loans that have led to, in the Indian Ocean region, the loss of sovereignty, whether it's in Sri Lanka or Pakistan or what was about to happen in the Maldives. And so I think we have a clear-eyed understanding of the need for us as like-minded democracies to work with other like-minded democracies like Japan and Australia to provide alternatives to countries in the region. We're not trying to make this a zero-sum game, but countries should, as they pursue necessary infrastructure development, not have to go down a road that's ultimately going to compromise their national security or their economic well-being. And we have, through our bilateral and now these quadrilateral sessions that we're doing with India, Japan, and Australia, we're working on sort of practical steps that we can take to coordinate on our finance development, so through the BUILD Act, the practical steps we can take to make sure our assistance programs, whether it's USAID or the Millennium Challenge Corporation, are helping to promote regional connectivity. And this is, you know, really one of the most exciting elements of the Indo-Pacific strategy, and where I expect to see a lot of progress. The President will be meeting with Prime Minister Modi and Prime Minister Abe in Japan at the G20, and we'll have an opportunity, I think, to, again, highlight this new partnership of ours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Now recognize the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm deeply concerned about the degradation of democracy in Bangladesh. When the people of Bangladesh went to vote in December, some were turned away. They were told polling stations were closed for lunch, had run out of ballots. And that's after reporters noticed that when polls opened, some ballot boxes already appeared full. And that's after the government of Bangladesh neglected to provide credentials and visas to most election monitors. And I would add that my own constituents who went to participate and saw multiple violations of basic election procedures. Maybe it's no surprise then that the Awami League won 96% of the seats contested. I think we need to take these issues very seriously. The government-appointed election commission says the election was legitimate, but I don't think we can leave it at that. Ambassador Wells, what is the State Department doing to support thorough, independent investigations into these allegations of election fraud? With all due respect, it seems that we're just moving on.
In our human rights report and in our public statement that followed the elections, we were clear that we did not consider the elections free and fair, given the widespread reports of irregularities that you've mentioned, included the ballot box stuffing and the intimidation of opposition polling agents and voters, and certainly the legal cases that were brought against opposition candidates in the lead up to the elections. We have urged Bangladesh and the Independent Election Commission to investigate these concerns and seriously. At the same time, we see that the 6 opposition members that were elected to Parliament have taken their seats, and we are encouraging the opposition to participate fully to demonstrate that there needs to be to provide a light on government practices. The fact that Bangladesh over the last years has made significant strides in lifting millions of.
The government of Bangladesh has raised the possibility of relocating Rohingya refugees living in Cox's Bazar to Basan Char, an island in the Bay of Bengal. NGOs have expressed concern about this possibility, noting that access to health care and other basic necessities could be limited on the island. It's particularly vulnerable to monsoons, and Yang Hee Lee, the UN Special Rapporteur for Myanmar, has questioned whether the island is even habitable. Ms. Steele, what is the administration's position on the potential relocation of Rohingya refugees to Basan Char?
We have always informed both the governments of Burma and Bangladesh that our position is to support voluntary returns, voluntary, safe, and dignified returns to Burma. In terms of Basan Char, we have joined other donors in saying that we need to have an assessment of the island in order to make sure that these are livable and safe for the refugees.
How long will such an assessment take?
We don't know, and we have been encouraging donors to come together and continue to put pressure on the government of Bangladesh. But as of now, the government of Bangladesh has continually, as a result of pressure from the international community, the government of Bangladesh has repeatedly postponed the movement of the refugees.
All right, thank you. And let me try to squeeze in one more question, again about Bangladesh. As a result of the security situation there, the State Department has ordered the departure of families of department personnel stationed there. State Department employees don't want to go there and be separated from their families, and that's not a great work situation. When does State anticipate allowing families to return to Bangladesh? Ambassador Wells.
Right. It's an ongoing process of reviewing the security situation and the government's ability to deal with potential terrorist incidents. The drawdown took place after the Holy Bakery attack that took place, on the diplomatic enclave. So, as somebody who has to recruit our officers to Bangladesh, I'm keenly interested in being able to take that step forward when appropriate.
All right. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Is the gentleman from Utah.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member for the Holiness Committee. Thank you to our witnesses who have come today. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit to Nepal and reference the election of 2017, which was a pretty significant mandate, and it seems like there's been some struggling since then. And I'm going to let you all decide who can best answer this question. Can you give me an update on our relationship with that government as the United States government and how that's going?
We have a good, close working relationship with the government of Nepal, which, the government has had, there have been many governments over the last 5 years, and so the prospect of having an election which brings in a government for a full term offers a greater stability in decision-making and greater opportunity to move forward. In addition to the assistance that we provide under USAID, we've launched with Nepal a Millennium Challenge Corporation Compact, which is a $500 million program. The Nepalese are contributing another $130 million. And it is an extraordinary sign, a signal of confidence in Nepal to demonstrate that, that working with Nepal, we can create conditions of good governance that will help serve as a model for other foreign direct investment. In addition to the assistance, we have Peace Corps volunteers who've been in Nepal for over 70 years. We are growing our defense relationship focused on disaster assistance and humanitarian relief. We provided over $190 million in earthquake relief and continue to play a very important role in helping that government develop the housing standards and the retrofitting. So it's a robust relationship that isn't just limited government to government, but really enjoys a strong people-to-people basis.
That's good. You talked a little bit earlier about China and relationship with some of these countries. A little worried about that as well and their acceptance of the China's Belt and Road Initiative. It seems like we're going down that same path there with China with the predatory lending. Can you speak to that? And is the Millennial Challenge helping with that, or what else can we be doing to change that course?
We certainly discuss with the leadership, and we had the foreign minister and foreign secretary here over the last several months to have partnership dialogues. We discussed with the leadership the concerns over predatory lending, the options that are available, whether it's through foreign direct investment, where American companies are most active. Obviously, Nepal has a very close relationship with India, which has a major role to play in Nepal and is Nepal's largest trading partner. So it's a subject of conversation, and certainly Nepal is aware of our concerns.
Is that enough to keep them from going down that path, and do we need to be doing more? And that's, I know that's a tough question and probably applies to the entire world, right? But
well, it's interesting. Recently, there was a joint U.S.-Chinese project in Nepal, a private sector project, a tunneling project, and that was what we sought to highlight to the government. When it doesn't matter whether it's Chinese, Indian, whoever is the lender, if the project is transparent, if it is competitively bid, if it meets international standards, we support it.
Sure.
Nepal needs infrastructure, but everyone needs to be careful about the terms that infrastructure is offered on.
Yeah. Ms. Steele.
Thank you. Nepal is one of our biggest target countries under the Indo-Pacific strategy. And through our assistance in the Indo-Pacific strategy, we were working with the government in order to address and prioritize their, the use of their public finances so that they can be more productive. We're helping them to generate revenue to better tax administration. We're helping them to improve the business processes in order to be able to attract more legitimate private enterprise investments so that they do not fall prey to the offerings of others that would make them go into a long-term unsustainable debt. And so that's what we're doing with them, and we're hoping that they will be able to improve their competitiveness and address their corruption, which is a major issue for how countries fall under the debt trap.
I'm pleased to hear that. I applaud those efforts and hope we can continue those and do even more, and that you'll continue to let Congress know what our role is in that. I think many of my colleagues are also very interested in that.
I think the support that you have given on both sides to the Indo-Pacific strategy is a very encouraging and a very strong impetus for us to be able to move and achieve the goals and objectives of the Indo-Pacific strategy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
We'll now recognize the gentlelady from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ambassador Wells, I have a question for you. According to the State Department's Congressional Budget Justification Book for fiscal year 2020, they write, India's emergence as a regional security provider and global leader is essential to advancing U.S. interests. However, in June 2019, the White House formally ended concessions for India under the Generalized System of Preferences, GSP, which exempted Indian goods worth more than $6 billion from import duties. This move came in the context of ongoing tensions over U.S. imposition of steel and aluminum tariffs. I'm curious if you could speak a little bit about what this impact is, how you think this GSP decision will impact our strategic relationship with India, and how the State Department is adjusting our foreign policy and engagement strategy because of it.
We have a multifaceted relationship with India, and on the whole, this is a partnership that's moving forward. That is it's the centerpiece, really, of an Indo-Pacific strategy, and Secretary Pompeo spoke to that yesterday in his public remarks. It doesn't mean we don't have frictions, and one of the frictions historically has been on trade, on tariff barriers. India has the highest tariff barriers of a G20 country. Historically, it's been a protected market, and so our failure to negotiate an agreement over the course of the last year and a half led to the decision to suspend the GSP benefits. And that said, when you look at the trade relationship, we have a $142 billion trade relationship. It increased 12% last year. U.S. exports increased 28%. The trade deficit went down 11%, to $24 billion. So, we see India making strategic purchases of, of defense industry or defense weaponry, of aviation, of energy. This is going to very much be at the top of the agenda when Secretary Pompeo visits India later this month.
Do we have any concerns, or should we be concerned that both the steel and aluminum tariffs and the GSP decision together could potentially push India closer to its cooperation with China, Russia, or even potentially Iran?
I don't think so, no. We're India's largest and best market. 20% of India's goods come here. There's Indian foreign direct investment in the United States. There's a huge interest by U.S. firms in India. As Prime Minister Modi begins his second term, he's preoccupied with job creation, and attracting foreign direct investment is going to be a key part of that strategy. So, trade, properly, conducted can be a huge strength to the relationship, and that's certainly our focus as we begin our engagement with Prime Minister Modi in his second term, is how do we, fix this part of the relationship so it better matches the positive trajectory we see in other areas.
Thank you. And recognizing some of the challenges and certainly maybe an uptick in some difficulties, in your opinion, is there anything else that Congress could be doing, could be assisting in to ensure that we're retaining and building upon the relationship, this already strong relationship that we have with India?
I think congressional support for the India-U.S. relationship has been extraordinary, and the designation of India as a major defense partner, the bipartisan support that the relationship enjoys has been critical and will continue to be critical. This is a relationship where we have 4 million Indian Americans who also provide great ballast to the relationship and perspective on the relationship, and so I would just say, please keep on providing that bipartisan consensus that we should be moving forward with India.
Thank you, Ambassador Wells, and I thank the other witnesses for being here today, and I yield back.
Thank you. We'll now go to a second round. I believe everyone here has asked one round of questions. Ms. Wells, or Ambassador Wells, I didn't promise you we could get by with just one round. The current Sri Lankan government came to power with overwhelming support in the Tamil community. The government has disappointed many in the Tamil community as far as its dedication to justice, peace, and reconciliation. There's little movement on a federal constitution giving autonomy to the Tamil regions. And of course, much more needs to be done on accountability for human rights violations that have occurred during the Civil War, and especially its last phases. The Sri Lankan military, and this is probably the most important aspect, continues to hold on to civilian lands in Tamil areas. And of course, the longer that's delayed, the longer they delay the return of that land, the more likely it is that the military occupation becomes permanent. Will we continue to press the government of Sri Lanka on these issues of reconciliation with the Tamil community, and especially the need for the military to give up land that it is occupying?
Yes, and we invited the Sri Lankan Foreign Minister and Foreign Secretary here to Washington for a strategic dialogue, and that was very much a part of the dialogue. We welcome the fact that Sri Lanka, has co-sponsored the UN Human Rights Commission resolution extending the international monitoring of its commitments to human rights, reconciliation, justice, and accountability. The progress has been slower than we would like to see.
I'll count on you to continue to make that a priority for us. What level of aid have we provided for the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh? Yeah, Ms. Steele.
The total amount of funding for the Rohingyas, both in Burma and Bangladesh, is approximately $500 million to date, starting in 2017.
So that's $500 million a year?
No, $500 million
Total.
since 2017.
Since 2017. So with the administration budget request, what would it be for the coming fiscal year?
A significant amount of the funding that goes to the Rohingya is humanitarian assistance, which is not included in the budget that you have reviewed.
Is not included in the...
In the budget that we are discussing. It is, for instance, for USAID, it's part of our Office of Foreign Disaster Assistance and Food for Peace, which is separate from the budget that we use.
I realize it's outside the purview of your agency. Do you happen to know what it is? Can you give us a number or...
I'm not aware of what the number is for,
so we'll have
for
to,
budget outside of
we'll have
my agency.
to put it together. Obviously, Bangladesh is a poor country and has taken in people that would otherwise be not only ethnically cleansed but subject to genocide. I realize that, I believe, Ambassador Wells, your purview does not extend to Myanmar, Burma. No. But the question I have, and I guess this affects your purview, is whether the United States will take the position that if the government of Burma, Myanmar does not extend citizenship and protection to the Rohingya who were born there, that we would support the transfer of North Rakhine State to Bangladeshi sovereignty. That's right on the border, literally, of your jurisdiction.
Well, I won't speak for my colleagues, but I think it's a traditional position of the State Department that we support the territorial integrity of countries and the sovereignty of countries.
But when the people of South Sudan were subject to horrific treatment by the Khartoum government, we were in effect the midwives for the creation of an independent South Sudan, and I won't say that that's worked out well, but we did support the creation of an independent state when a government in Khartoum could not.
Right. What we've focused on is, can we get the conditions in Myanmar so you can have Rohingya go and look and see what their neighborhoods look like? Are the conditions such that they have confidence in returning? How can we?
Does it and is citizenship and passports part of that?
The UN report recommendations listed citizenship as one of the key issues that would help restore confidence. I think right now, the Rohingya would like to return home if the conditions support a dignified return. And for those countries that are working in Myanmar and supporting the Myanmar government, it's how do we get the Myanmar government to create
I would say
those
if the
conditions?
Myanmar government doesn't announce that it is dedicated to the protection of these people and the issuance of citizenship documents, that we alter our position and call for the transfer of North Rakhine State to a country that will protect these people. This is their land. They've lived there for generations. They've been subject to ethnic cleansing and one might say attempted genocide. Certainly, if you lay that out compared to the facts of South Sudan, a change in international borders would be called for. Keep in mind, the government of Khartoum never denied the citizenship of the people of South Sudan. I'll turn to Ms. Steele. What steps can USAID and the State Department take to partner with the charitable efforts of the South Asia diaspora community in the United States to help the people of South Asia? How can you work with the large and generous diaspora community?
We have been working with them, in particular with the Indian diaspora, in order to identify areas. And they had expressed has the highest TB maternal and child mortality happens in India, and some of the most polluted cities in the world are in India. And so we have agreed to work together. Our proposed plan to create a foundation, the U.S.-India Foundation, using Indian private sector, is intended to catalyze and mobilize Indian resources to address our joint interests in development.
I thank you. And we often hear in Washington of public-private partnerships. When I hear that phrase, I get concerned that maybe the deal is too good for private investors seeking a profit. But in the case we're talking about here, we're talking about a public-private partnership with charitable intent. With that, I'll recognize the ranking member.
Thank you for the second round, Mr. Chairman. If we go back to Afghanistan, if a deal is struck with the Taliban, what concerns do you have with regards to the program, the progress we've made on the rights of Afghan women? And I want to kind of focus this again on, you know, we always stress building democracies versus let's build a stable government. And if we build a stable government, we can progress into these things, think a lot quicker. So I'd like to hear, Ms. Steele, if you want to answer that.
I do not cover Afghanistan, Congressman.
I'm sorry,
I would like to defer, to
Ms. Freeman.
Those proud women are in my jurisdiction. USAID has had a history since the early years, in fact, the entrance into Afghanistan, of working very closely with the women of Afghanistan and supporting their advancement. It's amazing to look back at 2001 when they had no access to education, to private sector, anything. And now, in 2018, when we can look at, I recently attended a trade show in India that was between Afghanistan and India, and there women attended and they were able to cut $5 million in contracts.
That trade show was in India?
Yeah.
And there are women from Afghanistan?
There were, indeed. And their attendance, their participation really highlighted their experience, the increase in their capabilities, and how much they shine outside in the business world. Currently, we have been able to leverage about $3.2 million in private sector loans to about over 1,700 women.
What are the results of that? What kind of loans? Are they creating businesses?
These are new business loans, exactly.
Are they becoming successful businesses?
Indeed, they are. We've been working with them, with the Women's Chamber there in Kabul, and to expand their access to not only financing, but also in terms of leveraging their ability to raise their voices and speak their concerns to the government as well.
Has the tolerance of the Taliban towards women in society, education, has that improved since we all remember how they came in? And I remember that one young girl that got shot in the eye, and as a signal that they don't want women being educated. Has their outlook changed on women becoming educated, women being involved in business?
I would highly doubt it, but I'd say to
Me
my
too.
colleague.
The Taliban say that their views on education have changed, and the proof is going to be in looking at the areas that they control or dominate and what is the situation there. And you see a variety of practices. You do see girls' schools operating. In some conservative places, they don't. In some places, they have more of a religious education. They divert from the curriculum of the Ministry of Education. But in the conversations that the Taliban are having with us and with other like-minded countries, they emphasize the fact that their views have evolved when it comes to education and working outside the house.
Let me ask you this, and what concerns do you have with the elements of the Taliban splintering off from the group and aligning themselves with ISIS, and how's that going to affect the progress that we've made if we do not have a stable government there?
It is certainly a possibility for members of the Taliban to hive off and join ISIS. Some members already have, and that's why it's going to be critical that any peace agreement contain those guarantees by the Taliban that they're opposed to any terrorist presence and will combat any terrorist presence on Afghanistan.
Well, that's why I keep bringing up, I think our focus should be on a stable government, because I look at South Korea after the Korean conflict. It wasn't what we would call a democracy, but after a short period of time, once they started gravitating that way, they're our sixth largest trading partner today. I look at Vietnam after the Vietnam War. We went in there to prevent communism. It's a communist country, but yet today it's a vibrant market economy, and we see baby steps moving in the right direction for human rights. We can't expect them to get to where we're at after our 200-year struggle, and we still don't have it right. So if we focus on those things that we know will stabilize a government, rule of law, honoring in contracts, basic human rights, drawing them this way as the people become more to experience liberty and freedom, I think then you'll see the changes that we want versus trying to push it the other way that causes the resentment in governments or groups like the Taliban. Mr. Chairman, I yield back and thank you for the second round. Thank you all.
You're free to leave.